Boys and girls, I have a story, but it's tucked into the middle of my sermon today, so you might want to sit on your primary treasure and your junior guide and look for it. It's about a soldier, the toughest soldier, the Marine in Korea. Our whole story today is an account from the life of Jesus, which gives us a little clue as to how Jesus treated those who were disabled. It's found in Mark, the 2nd chapter. And here we begin right at the start, verse 1. I suppose we could call this story the story of the man who raised the roof, or the story of the man who was let down by his friends, or the man who was at the end of his rope. Any number of titles, because this man went to great lengths to come into the presence of Jesus. You've heard it before. Let's ponder it and put our imaginations into operation as we go back a couple of thousand years and try to relive the scene. Mark 2, beginning with verse 1. And again he entered into Capernaum after some days, and it was noised that he was in the house. Whose house? This was Peter's house. If you traveled to the Holy Land today, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, you can still see the ruins of Capernaum, and you can still see the synagogue ruins, and you can still see the ruins of Peter's house. And straightway many were gathered together, insomuch that there was no room to receive them, no, not so much as about the door. And he preached the word unto them. And they come unto him, bringing one sick of the palsy, which was born of 4. And when they could not come nigh unto him for the press, they uncovered the roof where he was, and when they had broken it up, they let down the bed wherein the sick of the palsy lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, my son, thy sins be forgiven thee. Now we'll go to verse 10. That ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. He saith to the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, arise, and take up thy bed, and go thy way into thine house. And immediately he arose, took up the bed, and went forth before them all, insomuch that they were all amazed, and glorified God, saying, We never saw it on this fashion. How'd you like to have been there? Just barely elbow room in the crowded house. People on the outside looking through the windows, if there were any windows. People crowding around the door. No room to get through. Jesus was in town. Well, who was this man? He was a true outcast. He was disabled, that's so. He was palsied. He was an invalid. He couldn't apparently leave his bed. And he was also, according to the evidence that comes out, an invalid and disabled because of his own doing. Now there's a big difference, you see, between being disabled as a natural result of being born in a world of sin. That has happened to many people. And being disabled because of the results of your sin. Most commentators, those who have followed the story closely, and even the inspired word that we have in the book Desire of Ages, indicate that this man was disabled as a result of his life of sin. Most of them seem to indicate a social disease of some sort, which not only left the man in shambles as far as his own physical frame was concerned, but left him guilty and conscience-stricken and without hope. He had tried everything he could to find help. He had been to the doctors, and they had given him up as hopeless. He had been to the scribes and the rabbis, the church leaders, and they had the same as pushed him off the church steps, because anyone who was a victim of sickness or disablement or disease in the days of Jesus was considered a great sinner. And on top of that, to have it known without question that as a result of your own sin made you an even greater outcast. Now, there were those in the days of Jesus who were in trouble because of the natural results of a world of sin, such as the blind man in John the 9th chapter. You recall the disciples said to him as they passed the blind man, they said, "Lord, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus said, "Neither. Neither. But now you're going to see the work of God." And someday when Jesus comes again, if not before, we're going to see the work of God for the disabled, aren't we? There are some people who feel that we have evidence that before Jesus comes again, all of God's people are going to be restored under the showers of the latter rain. I even heard one preacher, well-known preacher, take the position that we're going to throw away our glasses and be completely whole before Jesus comes. And we also hear of stories of those who have been healed of their infirmities in every age. And we wish and long that it would be more frequent, don't we? This week I discovered something that I never thought of before, that there can be a difference between being disabled and being handicapped. I hadn't thought of it. Someone suggested it to me. I did a little looking up to find some definitions. And you know, there are, most of us are disabled in one way or another, aren't we? Some of us are getting along without our appendix, and some of us are getting along without our tonsils, and some of you have glasses, and some of us should. And there are some of us who have impairments of one sort or another, some more serious, some less serious. Two of my friends who have joined me on the platform today have what some people would consider a serious disablement, but they're not handicapped because they keep going. Nothing stops them. Last Saturday night we saw a picture of Johnny, who had a serious disablement, but she's not handicapped. She keeps going. Do you read me at all? And I like that. Now, whether this man in the story had been considered or had considered caving in and going into a dark room somewhere and waiting to die, I don't know. He had every reason to. But there was something that brought him hope in the presence of Jesus in that part of the country. He began to hear stories of the demoniac in the temple, for instance, right there in his hometown. The one who could only come down the aisle frothing and screaming and cursing Jesus. But Jesus knew what he was really trying to say. I need help. And Jesus had cast out the devil, and the demoniac had been restored. This infirmed man had heard the story of Peter's mother-in-law. Well, of course, you would expect it for Peter's mother-in-law. But he'd also heard the story of the crowds who had come until late into the night after the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, right there in the center of Capernaum. And how that the sick, the maimed, the halt, the blind, the deaf, the dumb had been healed. This man who was tortured by the realization of his sins took courage that if Jesus could reach the devil-possessed, perhaps he'd do something for him. He'd also heard about a leper who had pressed his way through the crowd down by the lake. And the crowd had fallen back trying to get away from him. And how the leper had gone up to Jesus and cast himself at Jesus' feet. The leper who was supposed to be untouchable and unclean, an outcast of the outcasts. And how Jesus had reached out his hand and touched him and had said, I will be thou clean. And this man took courage as he heard these stories. New hope began to come to his heart. But right there, something terrible happens often. When a person has found himself the victim of his own doing and realizes that he is suffering the results of his own sin, often the devil makes hay out of that and tries to convince him to not even consider coming to God because now he has bad motives, selfish motives. I have heard people under the same sort of guilt, and they say, I can't come to God now. That's a real shabby way to approach God. Here I have gone my own way and have forgotten about God and faith and Bible and religion. And now that I'm in trouble, now I'm going to come. I won't do it. And the devil stands behind and pushing. You can't do it. That's a raunchy motive. No way can you go into his presence now. In fact, I'd like to project ahead down to the very end of time when there comes a moment when thousands are going to be going from sea to sea and from coast to coast, beating on their chests and crying out in despair. They're seeking God now, but it's too late. And at that point, don't tell me the enemy isn't going to make use of everything he can. And he'll beat them over the head and he'll say, you who neglected God and faith and Bible and Jesus, now that you see the smoke rising, now that you see that the whole thing is about over, now you're trying to come to Jesus. No way. Your motives are too bad. It must have happened to this man, this invalid, this outcast. He was a nobody in town. He was looked down on except by a few friends. Perhaps his friends were of his same ilk. Maybe they were those who were partners in his sins, because sinners often like to hang together. But he talked them into it. He told them about the demoniac. I can see him telling them about the blind man, telling them about the leper. And their belief began to grow in this man, Jesus. And so they consented to take him on his bed, whatever form it was. You see all kinds of pictures of it, never the same. But to take him on his bed and go and find Jesus. Well, they couldn't get in, as you know. And when they couldn't get in, it was the invalid man's own suggestion that they break up the roof and let him down in front of Jesus. You'll have to admit that this invalid wasn't bashful. And in fact, he must have not had very many inhibitions, which tells you something. Usually when a person has no inhibitions, and he will go through the ends that this man did to come into the presence of Jesus in front of the whole town, it must mean that at least he was at the end of his own resources, and he didn't care what people thought. Nothing mattered anymore. He was determined to come into the presence of Jesus. You had the same sort of thing happening with people like Zacchaeus in Jericho, who ran down the street with the street urchins and climbed the tree with the others in the tree there, trying to see Jesus. And Zacchaeus was the director of the Bureau of Internal Revenue. Can you imagine? Running down the street with the street urchins to find Jesus. But he was desperate. He needed something. So this man finally comes down through the roof in front of Jesus. His big moment had come. He had been let down many times, but this time it was going to end in triumph. And according to the record, it says when Jesus saw their faith, who were these men? They're not named. In fact, you can go through the scriptures and you can again and again look and find people who were great in faith or did something good for which we have no name. You might want to consider the anonymous Christians someday as you read the story. I heard a sermon one time, Christians Anonymous. Those whose names we've never sung or named our children after, who were great in faith. Somehow they rose to the occasion. And whatever you want to call faith today, Jesus saw it in them and the man lying before him when he saw their faith. Then the first words that this man heard were words of hope and words of comfort. Please, son. And one translation has it, my son, my son. Can you imagine what that must have meant to a troubled heart, and guilt-ridden, hopeless, my son? Well, right there, you'd have a feeling of acceptance, wouldn't you? My son, my daughter. And then Luke adds a phrase that Mark doesn't have. Son, be of good cheer. Well, how could you miss even at that point? Is there someone here today who is feeling despondent and discouraged? Is there someone here today that thinks there's no hope for you? Perhaps there's someone here who wonders if they've committed the unpardonable sin. Maybe someone who is tortured by the unsatisfied desires of a life, trying to find fun instead of happiness. Perhaps there's someone here who is weak and have discovered, even though you have your eyes and your ears and your limbs, that you're disabled when it comes to backbone. You have no self-discipline. You have a backbone like wet spaghetti, and it's hard for you to even get out of bed in the morning. And so life goes on, and you wish that you had been born in South Dakota with the rest of the stubborn Dutchmen. And so you decide that that's the way it is. Life goes on. Some are weak and some are strong. Some people were born to be fuel for the fires of hell, and perhaps you were one of them. Today, please identify yourself with the man lying on the mat at the end of his rope. And Jesus looks into his eyes and says, my son, my daughter, be of good cheer. I'd like to propose to you today that if the religion of Jesus Christ isn't strong enough to save the weakest person in the world, it's no good. But I believe it's good. Do you? My son, my daughter, be of good cheer. And then comes what he'd been looking for many sleepless nights. Thy sins be forgiven thee. That's all he wanted. That's all he wanted? Oh, I thought he went into Jesus' presence to get well. I thought he went to all the trouble of getting his friends talked into it and coming down through the roof so he could go walking and running down the streets again. No, this is all he wanted. According to the record, he was content at this point to live or die. It made no difference. And really, if you take a long look at it, you'll have to admit that if you could know that you're right with God this moment, would you be content to live or die? I've had young people say, if I knew that I was right with God, I'd want someone to kill me quick before I would ruin it again. So he settled back in absolute peace, willing for whatever Jesus had in mind next. Which reminds me of my Marine friend. Went to school with him. During the days when I was in college, there were a bunch of these leathernecks back from Korea. They were a little older than the rest. They were going to school on the GI Bill. There were several Marines. And my friend Richard had had a religious background. In fact, he had had a religious background, the same as yours, the same subculture, most of you sitting here today. He knew about the second coming of Christ. He knew about the millennium, the 1,000 years. He knew about the first resurrection of the just and the second resurrection of the unjust. And one night he found himself climbing a hill with his platoon. He was the leader. They were supposed to take this hill, and they had understood that the hill behind them had been cleaned out of any enemy fire, but that was where the misunderstanding came in. As Richard and his group were climbing the hill to go over the top, suddenly from the opposite hill, a machine gun opened up on them. The lone gunner was very clever. As he came across the hill with his machine gun fire, he would complete one round, then he'd raise his machine gun a few degrees and come back across. Then he'd raise it some more and come back across. And as Richard was leading his platoon up the hill, he could hear his men below him, one by one, being hit, groaning, crying out, dying. And he knew that he was finished. He said he lay there in the moonlight, hugging the ground, knowing that his turn was next. And he began to think of things that he had heard of when he was a boy. And he began to pray. And this is what he prayed. Lord, I don't deserve anything. I don't have much time. It's just a matter of minutes, and I'll be gone. But he said, Lord, I'd like to pray one request, please. Would you help me so that I can come up in the right resurrection? Would you please forgive my sin and help me to come up in the right resurrection? He doesn't know to this day why he came back from that hill untouched. But when I saw him in college, he was one dedicated Christian who had a purpose. And that was to get back into the service as fast as he could as a chaplain and help the soldiers, the Marines, in their belief in God. He didn't care that night whether he lived or died. There was something far bigger. He wanted to know that he was right with God. This man on the bed in the house of Peter didn't care whether he lived or died or walked again. All he was after was peace with God. And when he found that his sins were forgiven, he lay back in absolute blissful silence, too happy for words. And at that very moment, something interesting began to take place. It's a phenomenon called healing. Because healing often takes place when I know that our sins are forgiven. We have peace with God. You know, even medical men are saying 70% of our sickness is a result of emotional or mental problems. A long time ago, it was predicted by one who knew through revelation that 90% of our problems with health originate in our mind. There was something more than just peace at work, however. In the presence of the miracle-working power of the Creator, things began to take place. However, something weird was taking place in the circle of spies. There was a Jewish spy ring from Jerusalem, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the rabbis. And when they heard these words, "Son, thy sins be forgiven," this was more than they could take. They had been looking for something to hang Jesus on, and this, they figured, would do it. It was early in Jesus' ministry, by the way. We're only in Mark, the 2nd chapter. But they were already out for his life. And they began to look at each other with those looks of disgust. Their body language screamed. Jesus picked it up. He also picked up something more that Jesus could pick up because of his connection with his Father. He knew what they were thinking. He knew the details of their thoughts. And let's not just attribute this ability to Jesus, because Peter did the same thing with Ananias and Sapphira, if you recall later. Sometimes people say, if Jesus wasn't operating as God, how could he read people's thoughts? Peter did. And with this insight given him from above, Jesus came straight through to their hearts and said, which is easier? To say to a person, "Thy sins be forgiven," or to say to a person, "Rise, take up your bed and walk"? "But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. He says to the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, arise, and take up thy bed, and go thy way unto thine house." Well, right here, there are people who get bogged down in the theology of healing and of faith. I have heard people discuss this experience and some of the others of Jesus, and they say, now the man could have stayed there in his bed, but he had to exercise faith. I've heard people talk this way at the bedside of other invalids, and there are those who have gotten very bold and brazen to even suggest that something we do, or something we work up, or something we talk ourselves into, or some kind of mental gymnastics that we can get worked up will cause it to happen. Have you ever had that feeling? I'd like to suggest that you study the theology of faith a little closer, if you ever have. Let me ask you, was this man healed because he began to say to himself, well, now, Jesus has said, take up your bed and walk. Now, if I can believe strong enough that I am healed, then I think it will happen. That is a very subtle form of do-it-yourself. Did the dust say that at creation? When God formed man out of the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, did the particles of dust say, well, now, if we can believe strong enough, we can become a man? I'd like to remind you that in the presence of the life-giver, the Creator, the dust jumped to attention. And if you were lying on a bed and you were an invalid and you were disabled and you were incapacitated from every angle, and you stand or lie or sit or whatever in the presence of the life-giver, the Creator who speaks the word, and worlds slip off the end of his fingers, do you think that you would lie there and debate as to the theology of faith or the theology of healing? I would like to propose that you jump to your feet in the presence of the life-giver and that it is spontaneous. Do you hear me at all? And all of our analysis is simply very feeble as to how it happened. He jumped to his feet, and please notice that now things were different. He didn't go back out through the roof. The crowds that were so tightly packed in suddenly found a way for him. And they fell back. Fell back where? Well, they found some place to fall back. Because you watch this man now taking his bed, and whether it was an army cot or a steel bed with springs or whether it was a blanket or a sleeping bag, at least it was a bed, and he walks out before them all. And as they fall back to let him go through, they're saying, we have seen strange things today. We have seen strange things. Oh, I'm looking forward to seeing strange things again, aren't you? My friend Jimmy here on the platform who called for the offering, he's looking forward to seeing those things, to seeing them. One sat alone beside the highway begging. His eyes were blind. The light he could not see. He clutched his rags and shivered in the shadows. Then Jesus came and made the darkness flee. Unclean, unclean, the leper cried in torment. The deaf, the dumb, in helplessness drew near. The fever raged, disease had gripped its victim. Then Jesus came and cast out every fear. My friend Mary, who wrote my name in Braille at Christian Record, who offered prayer, is looking forward when the eyes are opened wide. I'm thankful for the grace and the strength for the day in the meantime. But don't you all rejoice as you contemplate the day when people walk again and talk again and see again and jump again and hear again when Jesus comes to stay. The conclusion of the story is, number one, that Jesus has power on earth to forgive sins, and that's good for you today. And number two, he has power to enable us to walk in the Christian life. You can see two things here, two of the beautiful aspects of the gospel, dealing with our past sins and giving us strength to walk as Christians. as well. Because we go to the great physician, not only to get forgiven, but we go to the great physician to get well too. Shall we thank him for it as we pray? Dear Lord, we would like to thank you for the good and exciting stories of yesteryear. We've seen ourselves in the picture. Maybe we're the infirmed man. Maybe we're part of the curious throng. Maybe we're one of those who let him down in front of Jesus. Wherever we see ourselves, accept our gratitude for what Jesus is like. Thank you for forgiving us like you did this man. And thank you for the promise to enable us to walk. Help us as we walk the way this week, spiritually. And help us to trust you for all that you want to do when you come again. In Jesus' name.